Now I'm going to read this. It's almost the same thing that I just read, but the formal presentation of this session is now being recorded and will be posted on the public-facing version of the church website. If you do not wish your image or voice recorded, you should turn off your camera and microphone now. The question and answer session will not be recorded. The end of the recording will be announced. Okay, so we'll begin our formal presentation. And I want to introduce our illustrious presenters today. We have Dr. Marilyn Hosea. Can you wave, Marilyn? There she is. Dr. Marilyn Hosea is the founding director of Org Learning 2 LLC, a consulting firm that provides a variety of services to nonprofit and public sector organizations. Hosea received her doctorate in business administration from Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. Her research agenda centered on how individuals and organizations learn, change, and develop in enduring ways. Dr. Hosea recently completed an assignment working as a U.S. government resource consultant for the 2018-2019 Hurricane Disaster and Recovery Team in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. She's presently working with organizations that are adjusting to new realities spurred by COVID-19 pandemic stay-at-home edicts. Dr. Hosea also teaches Leading in the New Era, Innovation and Change, and Social Justice at Regis University. Hosea is a fourth-generation African-American Coloradan, currently a member of the Denver Black Reparations Council, or DBRC. That's Marilyn. Now we have Lottie. Lottie is our host. Can you wave? That's Lottie Lieb Dula. She is a retired financial strategist, an advocate for reparations for slavery. After her mother died, Lottie began to sort through family ephemera hidden in boxes that hadn't been opened in many years. She found evidence of slaveholding. After researching her genealogy and reaching out to other descendants of slaveholders, Lottie joined Coming to the Table, a grassroots national group that brings together descendants of enslavers and descendants of the enslaved to work toward racial healing. Lottie has committed to making reparations for her family's role in enslaving Africans. She is the founder of reparationsforslavery.com. 4 is a numeral. reparationsforslavery.com, a portal for white families wishing to walk the path of racial healing through making reparations. Lottie serves on Coming to the Table's Reparation Working Group, convenes the Denver chapter of Coming to the Table, and is a founding donor of the Denver Foundation's Reparations Affinity Group and Fund. Then we have Harold Fields. Hi, Harold. Harold is active in restorative justice and racial reconciliation projects in Denver and around the nation. He facilitated a citywide monthly racial dialogue that had been continuously active since 1997, the Second Tuesday Race Forum, that I was so fortunate before it ended, I got to attend about 4 of those. He was a founder of Multiracial Families of Colorado and was the national training director for the documentary Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep north about the most prominent slave trading family in America. How many of you have seen Traces of the Trade? Good. It's so profound. Yeah. He served on the board trustees for the Denver Foundation for 6 years and is now the chairperson of the Denver Black Reparations Council. In 2017, he was honored by the Colorado ACLU with the Carl Whitehead Memorial Award for a Lifetime of Achievement in Advancing Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. Harold earned a degree in civil engineering from Oklahoma State University and spent over 30 years with IBM and the airline as a systems designer and program manager. Okay, so is everybody, we're all in, and we have one chat. Okay, yes, it's a good idea to use chat, and we will talk about how I will help our presenters by facilitating the questions when we get to the Q&A. But during the presentation, we won't ask any questions. There'll just be the presentation, a 2-minute break, and then the Q&A. So with that, I just want to thank you all for coming and thank our presenters for coming, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, Lottie, you want to bring up the slides? Well, I want to thank Patricia and the racial equity team for the invitation to share with you our thoughts about reparations. But I would first also like to express our prayers for the thousands of families who have been impacted by the terrible fires that are raging in Colorado and the West. And we hope that some of this snow provides some relief to the firefighters who are giving so much to be on the front lines of that. So let's start with a little warm up. I'm showing you 5 cards, and I would like you to choose one of those cards, remember it. Now I'm going to take one of them away. Did your card disappear? Now let's go back. Choose another one and remember it. Now I'm going to take that one away. Did that card disappear also? Oh, of course, there's a trick to this. Take a look at the original 5 cards. Look at those cards and notice that not a single one of those cards is in the second group. So no matter what you did, the card you selected wasn't going to show up, was going to disappear. Since they're all face cards and look similar, it was easy for your mind to assume that they were from the same set. This demonstrates how easy it is to have our attention focused on just one item of what appears to be a random set. Now, Lottie, I'm pushing. There we go. Now let's do another quick exercise. Think of a number between 1 and 10. Got it? Multiply that number times 9. Now, if that's a 2-digit result, add them together. For example, 32 would be 3 plus 2, which equals to 5. Subtract 5 from the number you got. Convert that to a letter. For example, if A is 1, B is 2, and so on. Now think of a country that starts with that letter, the letter that you chose. Now think of an animal that starts with the last letter.
Yes.
And then a fruit that starts with the last letter of the animal. Then we kind of taking through the tour. Did anybody get this combination? Most of us Americans will come up with Denmark, kangaroo, and orange. And that's because our brains make associations. These associations are heavily influenced by our culture. If you grew up and lived in Hong Kong or Kenya, you'd probably come up with a different set of answers. But there are other countries that start with the letter D. For example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or Djibouti, or Dominica. And the kangaroo is not the only one that starts with the K. There's a killer whale, the king cobra, the Komodo dragon. And there are other choices that start with, other than the orange, like okra or onion. So some of us are familiar with the $100,000 Pyramid TV show or the Family Feud. And these are examples of popular shows that celebrate and reward our interest in categories. We're actually tuned to put things together into categories. Well, let's take a peek at one of our founding documents, the Constitution. The opening words are, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity." But you know, it's clear that not everybody was included in "we the people." Historically, women and slaves could not vote, couldn't serve on juries, run for office, or even own property. And certainly the indigenous native residents were not included. A friend of mine, Elaine Grant, says that when you talk about history, there are three questions you must always ask: who's telling it, who benefits, and who's missing? So let's look at another founding document. The second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, Deborah Tannen, who you may know as a noted linguist and author, was given a tour of the National Archives, and she saw the original draft, and she was surprised to learn that it included the phrase, "the pursuit of happiness for all." This word and this wording was omitted from the final. It points to the cultural belief of the founders in individualism. Imagine the ripple effects if the words "for all" had been left in the document. So clearly, we're not done with founding. It was William Faulkner, excuse me, that said, "The past is not dead. In fact, it's not even past." And George Orwell warned us that those who control the past control the future. So I think we need to come up with a proper diagnosis. When we talk about reparation for slavery and its consequences, it's critical to start with a diagnosis. It does no good for a patient with advanced colon cancer to be dismissed as someone having indigestion, or even worse, not to be diagnosed at all. So we want to do a diagnosis of what the problem is we're looking at. My people have experienced 246 years of slavery compared to the 155 years of freedom that we have now. So we've not really been freed as long as we've been enslaved. Human beings were denied liberty at its worst so that other human beings could enjoy liberty at its best. The book Transatlantic Slave documents that 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. Of that number, 10.7 million survived the dreaded Middle Passage, taking them to North America, the Caribbean, and South America. According to Albert Roboteau in the book Slave Religion, only 4.5% of those Africans were brought to Canada and the United States. That's around 427,000 Africans. So where did the rest go? Central and South America got the overwhelming majority. For example, Jamaica got 7.8%. St. Domingo got 9%. Cuba got 7%. And Brazil got a whopping 38% of that trade, 3.6 million persons. Children typically made up 26% or more of a slave ship's human cargo. These captured Africans could be held for months in dungeons waiting for enough stolen people to arrive to make a profitable load. So on the average, the voyage took just over 2 months on top of the months they were waiting in dungeons. And because of filthy conditions, a range of epidemic pathogens and periodic breakouts of violent resistance and filthy conditions. Because of that, between 12 and 13% of those who were put on the ships did not arrive and didn't survive the voyage. They were thrown overboard. And it has been well documented how the migration of sharks forever changed to follow these ships to consume the bodies of those that were thrown overboard. Bringing slaves into the United States was banned in Congress in 1808. Yet by 1860, the nation's Black population had jumped from 400,000 to over 4.4 million. And 3.9 million of those were enslaved people. So the primary reason was natural increase, which was a distinguishing feature of the American style of slavery. Between 1790 and 1860, the US slave population increased between 25 and 33% each year, every year, because these Africans were forced to breed to supply the demand for labor. In the United States, on average, a slave mother gave birth to between 9 and 10 children. Their children were often stolen from them and sold away. Then many of these women were forced to nurse the enslavers' children, care for them, tend to them, and raise them. Now, this was a different pattern than was used in Brazil, where enslaved Africans were still being brought in by ship, while the American enslaved were forced to breed. So over time in Brazil, they were able to stay closer to their culture and their languages. In the United States, we were cut off from that knowledge. Slavery was the foundation for the US economy and wealth. Historian David Blight says that by 1860, there were more millionaires, all of them slaveholders, living in the lower Mississippi Valley than anywhere else in the United States. In the same year, nearly 4 million enslaved persons were worth some $3.5 billion, making them the largest single financial asset in the entire US economy. They were worth more than all the manufacturing and railroads combined. So of course the war was rooted in these two exploding and competing economies. What eventually ripped apart America's political culture was slavery's expansion into Western territories. And that's when the stuff hit the fan. Now, I worked on a documentary that some of you have seen about the largest slave trading family in American history, the DeWolf family. It's called Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep North. This family was from Rhode Island. And during the time of Thomas Jefferson, James DeWolf, their ancestor, was a US senator from Rhode Island. He was the second richest man in America, and he had more ships than the US Navy. The whole economy of New England depended on the slave trade. You were either making the rum, building the ships, insuring the voyages. So they moved rum from Bristol to Ghana, and where they traded for captured Africans to take them to the DeWolf plantations in Cuba. There they traded the Africans for sugar and molasses to bring back to Rhode Island to complete the triangle. We took 10 of the DeWolf descendants from Rhode Island to Ghana, to Cuba, and back to see where their wealth came from. And in the documentary, they talk about how the journey that they took caused them to support reparations. The process of abolition really then is incomplete. And why is that? That's because the 13th Amendment contains a loophole. When it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So although slavery was abolished in 1865, this clause allowed for a harmful and deadly form of enslavement to be embedded into American institutions. The loophole has been used as a political tool in the form of mass incarceration and criminalization. Why do I call it deadly? It's because these Black people were no longer considered a financial asset to a plantation owner who needed to treat them in a way to keep them healthy. They were now like commodities leased from the state who could be worked to death and replaced with somebody else. You know, the way companies today tend to treat employees that are not valued. So what does it mean to be freed? At the end of the Civil War, the nation had some important questions to consider. What can free people do that people who aren't free cannot? What would freedom look like to enslaved people? And perhaps more importantly, what would freedom look like to their masters? According to Catherine Frank, in her book Repair, slavery and freedom were not binary opposites. There was a lot of middle ground between them, where the freed people, and I say freed with the D on the end, the freed people could possibly be re-enslaved, and they could be controlled by laws that their former enslavers created. This D marked them with a badge of inferiority. That dangling D bound freed people to a past, marked their futures as freed, but not free people. This kind of freedom formerly enslaved people that they got would somehow be something less than the freedom that white people felt they received as a matter of natural law. So free people versus free people, they became a permanent undercast. They were freed to cook the white folks' food. They were free to raise their children. They were free to work for them and clean their houses. And they were free to entertain them. And sometimes they were forced to dance and to fight and to perform. And you can see that holdover in the dominance of a lot of Black people in the sporting world today. So after slavery, there were a number of things that came together to keep perpetuating a legacy. Field order number 15, 40 acres and a mule, was created on January 16th, 1865. After completing his march into the Georgia coast, General Sherman issued special field order number 15 that established the provision of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground designated for settlement of the Negroes not made free by acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States. This territory was to be settled under Sherman's orders, included the islands from Charleston, south of the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River. In the next few months, several thousand Black families, maybe 40,000 or 50,000 people altogether, were settled on what was called Sherman's land. They got their 40 acres, and the Army gave each one of them a mule. The Army had an enormous number of mules for carrying stuff around. Now, President Andrew Johnson, who came into office as soon as Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, was a racist Southerner, and he quickly ordered all that land be given back to the former slave owners. Then we had slavery by another name, which became the convict leasing, where people were put into prison when they couldn't prove that they had a job. And then they were leased out sometimes right back to some of the same plantations in which they were enslaved. The South began to create, after Reconstruction, a whole series of Black code laws which criminalized Black behavior that would make it easy to take advantage of that loophole in the Constitution. And we know that there was a lot of lynching. There were over 4,700 documented cases of lynching in the United States. I lived through the period of Jim Crow segregation. Many of you probably went through that period as well, but probably had a very different experience of Jim Crow than I had. As I said at the beginning, before you can design a cure or prescribe medicine, there's got to be a proper diagnosis. And this gives you a sense of the issues that we were dealing with during slavery and after slavery. Now I'm going to turn this over to Lottie so that she can talk about her own personal discoveries. And Lottie, let me tell you that I've discovered that if I wait a few minutes, I got to click on the screen again before I can move forward, because sometimes it seems to kind of go out on me. So just be aware of that dynamic as you're going through the screens.
Thank you, Harold. And yes, this is brand new. Sharing technology is sort of brand new for us as a team. So let me just see if I can get this going here. There we go. All right, well, thank you. My name is Lottie Liebdula, and I'm a proud descendant of Colorado pioneers. I'm also a descendant of slaveholders, and I'm here because I support the national movement for reparations. Now, 10 years ago, if you'd told me that I'd be supporting reparations, I would never have believed it. What happened? There we go. As a fiscal conservative, I believe the playing field was going to be level for everybody. And I'm sure we all grew up with all of these same messages, especially this one. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Yeah. Now, my journey began in 2015 when my mother died. And there she is on her ill-fated wedding day, but she looks beautiful. I began the process of going through 4 generations of family ephemera, more than 30 boxes. It was a real chore when every box was labeled family treasure, and I even had nightmares of being buried in these boxes. Well, one of the first boxes I opened belonged to my great-grandmother, and she had been really proud of her lineage holder heritage. She, in fact, had been the genealogist of the Mayflower Society, and she belonged to all kinds of other groups. Daughters of the American Revolution, the Colonial Dames, name a group. She was proud to be a member of it. Next, I found boxes with my great-grandfather's things. Now, he was a true Colorado pioneer, and he arrived in Denver by stagecoach in 1860, before Colorado was even a state. Now, he founded the mining and railroad industries here, and in 1871, he became a territorial legislator. You can see his certificate there on the right. He's famous for having brought forward the legislation to found the Colorado School of Mines. And that portrait there that I'm holding on to there is at the Colorado School of Mines. Now, you can still see signs of the agricultural land grants he received in the 1860s in Golden. Some of the land was given to found the School of Mines, and what's left is now a tree grant park right there. All right, back to those pesky boxes. The next box I opened contained my grandmother's keepsakes. Now, I was delighted to find photos of her high school plays she'd acted in, and what fun to page through her 1907 Smith College yearbook and to see her in this Victorian basketball uniform. Looking through the quaint social clubs, I found the beginnings of my grandmother's lifelong passion for the arts, passions I also share. But I also made a discovery that took my breath away. I found that she had been a member of the KKK Social Club, as well as the Orangemen, 2 groups steeped in hate and racism. Now, I started going through her husband, my grandfather's things, with some trepidation. What in the world was I going to find there? Now, he had been a beloved judge, famous for his fairness. Surely there'd be nothing in Judge Carey's belongings to give me pause about my heritage, I hoped anyway. Well, I was amazed to find some mid-19th century era daguerreotype photos, and with them a very nondescript looking little black book. Now I opened it and I was thrilled to discover that it belonged to my grandfather's grandfather, William Hayes Paxton. As I opened it, I saw the perfect penmanship and the neat rows of figures, and I thought, wow, so this is where I get my business sense from. How cool is that? It appeared to be a business ledger of some sort, but as I paged through it, it became clear that I was looking at inventory records for a Mississippi cotton plantation. I started getting really nervous. I stopped cold as I read the inscription on pages 27 through 30. Loss of slaves by war. Each line had a name, an age, and a value. I felt sick. I was the descendant of slaveholders. Now, like many descendants, I had no prior knowledge of my family's true history in the South. That history had really been conveniently erased, much like the history of slavery has been erased from our textbooks, honestly. But just as Harold described, here was evidence that some of my ancestors had become millionaires in the Mississippi Delta, the majority of their wealth coming not just from their land grants, and there are plenty of those, but from the value of human chattel. What's become clear to me is this: as enslaved Africans were effectively building this country, my white ancestors were not only amassing wealth and social advantage, they were building the legal and economic structures that have prevented Black people from accumulating wealth themselves. We the people? Well, it's clear what that means. We the white people. Now, I wanted to figure out how my family fit into this puzzle, so I did a bit of research, and here's what I found. It all started with Elisha Paxton, my third great-grandfather. Now, he started a plantation near Lexington, Virginia, beginning around 1815. From roughly 1830 on, Elisha used profits from his plantation to send 6 sons to college. Now, most of them pursued law degrees at Washington College, which is now Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. Then, in the 1830s, several, there's my second great-grandfather. From roughly 1830 on, Elisha, in the 1830s, several of Elisha's sons, including my second great-grandfather, moved with their uncle to the Mississippi Delta near Vicksburg. There, they set up a law practice as well as multiple cotton plantations, the same cotton plantations that were detailed in that ledger. Now, this uncle, Alexander McNutt, became governor of Mississippi by 1837. He was a colleague of Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederacy. Now, here are some pre-Civil War maps of those plantations on Deer Creek near present-day Arcola, Mississippi. Now, most of these plantations eventually went bust, and my second great-grandfather, William, lost his shirt, according to his brother's memoirs. But, you know, it didn't matter because he could just rely on his law practice to earn a living. He just moved to New Orleans and set up shop. Now, let's look at one of the adjoining parcels. Bolin Lucas and Jim Collier had both worked on the Paxton plantations. Bolin Lucas, as an enslaved man, had been the Paxton's trusted slave driver, while Jim Collier was a foreman. After emancipation, they went into business together, bought this adjacent parcel, and began farming. Jim Collier soon died. His estranged wife sued for possession of the land, and since Bolin Lucas was illiterate, was able to deceive him and take the land. In fact, 95% of Black farmland has been lost since 1900, much of it due to legal treachery like this, and like what my family has participated in, honestly. Now, as we head into the 20th century, how level does that playing field look to you? Not so level, I think. Next, let's briefly look at the effects of programs that catapulted many white families, including my parents, and probably your families as well, into the middle class. In 1933, we've got one of the New Deal Acts, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This aimed to help white farmers by cutting farm production and thus forcing out food prices. It's great for the farm owners, the landowners. However, less production meant less work for thousands of poor Black sharecroppers who lost their access to their land and their livelihoods. Now, the establishment of the FHA in 35 and Fannie Mae in 38 gave white families the ability to finance and insure new homes, but Black families were effectively blocked from accessing these programs. Social Security in 1935, response to the Great Depression. By design, many Black workers were not covered, including farm and domestic workers. This means that roughly 40% of Black people in the South can't access these benefits. Then there's the GI Bill. After World War II, many families used proceeds from the GI Bill to get an education, start a business, or purchase a home. My father certainly did all of those things. We know Black veterans are blocked outright from receiving home or business loans, but the same thing happens with the education benefit. In the end, only 20% of Black veterans that apply are accepted into these programs. The result, by the 1950s, many white families have joined the middle class, while many Black families are held back. And there isn't time to go over all these things, and you could actually spend hours detailing all of the legislative actions that are holding people back. But in the end, you can see today a Black family's average net worth is just 1/10 that of a white family. And there you go. Now, let's look at our history one more time. White colonists, including some of my ancestors, enslaved Africans for 250 years, using profits from their unpaid labor to amass wealth. Then after emancipation, established the Black codes and Jim Crow laws to further limit any kind of Black progress. Now we've conveniently forgotten this history and blame Black people for their lack of economic parity. I think it's time we looked at that bootstrap argument again. For me, the bottom line is this. I believe that reparations are due for 250 years of slavery and the institutional racism that followed. Why? Because families like mine created and upheld laws designed to both advantage white economic interests while crushing Black efforts to create wealth. And families like yours and mine benefited. All white families benefit. These the effects of this continue to this day. In fact, recent studies have found that institutional racism is crushing our GDP. And thank you to David Alley, who's in the audience there. He found a report by the Kellogg Foundation. It's called The Business Case for Racial Equity. And it basically states that 8 trillion of GDP has been lost due to institutional racism. This is correlated with unequal access from everything from equal opportunity in education to poor access to business loans, and the list goes on. By 2040, whites are going to be in the minority. That's a fact. And my question is, what does the economic future of this country look like if white people continue to block Black economic progress? To me, reparations is not charity or a gift. It is just compensation for legislated economic damage to an entire people. Ultimately, I believe the economic future of this country depends on redress. And if white people like you and me are not working actively to reimagine and rebuild these structures, we're just as complicit as our ancestors were. Slavery didn't end, it merely evolved. Thank you.
Hi, this is Marilyn. I chose to begin this particular section with, oops, it's moving fast, with the picture of Martin Luther King, and specifically the fact that he started this particular speech with a word of promissory note owed to Blacks, making amends for the enslavement of African Americans. He did not mention the word reparations. But we do know that when we look at racism and discrimination and how it's choked economic and social opportunity for African Americans in every chapter of our history, during enslavement, emancipation, Reconstruction, civil rights, and now today. Ralph Ellison was an American novelist, a literary critic, and scholar. During his lifetime, he explored crucial themes such as race, Black nationalism, and activism. However, Ellison is best known for his novel, The Invisible Man, which won the National Book Award in 1953. In this important work, he described the painful reality of being Black in America. Most of us remember reading this amazing novel as a must-read piece of African-American literature. In this portion of our presentation, I've been commissioned to introduce a brief context to the reparations dialogue, specifically how the circumstance of former enslaved or emancipated African Americans migrated to the Rocky Mountain West and to Denver. This was a lengthy journey that differed from the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North or the Northeast. As a fourth-generation Coloradan, I recognize the history and stories of my elders who experienced invisible lives that often bumped up with systematic inequality in the form of housing discrimination, unequal education, police brutality, incarceration, poor health outcomes, and massive wealth and opportunity gaps. Again, I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. So let's begin. I have mouse problems today. Okay, here it goes. The migration of African Americans to Colorado typically involved either travel by rail or by wagon. Either way, an intended trip could take years to accomplish. A stopover, for example, in St. Louis could mean a year stayover for additional money, or staying with relatives for a moment that would never be repeated. The adjacent Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad reached the Kansas-Colorado border in 1873 and took another 3 years to reach Pueblo. According to my family stories, traveling by train had two advantages. First, it was faster than a wagon. And secondly, Black porters were an invaluable resource about where to go and where not to stay, where there were good places to go for jobs, and how to avoid bad situations. Over the course of the Great Migration, more than 7 million African Americans left home in the South to resettle in northern and western states. This is a photo of the Biffle family taken in 1904. In that year, Primus Biffle, a 19-year-old day laborer living in Pueblo, Colorado, arrived in Erin, Tennessee to collect his orphan nephews and nieces, who were all under the age of 11. Traveling by wagon, they finally arrived in Pueblo. Unfortunately, this uncle suddenly died merely a month after successfully rescuing his kin. The children were then put into a local orphanage, waiting adoption by a white family, seeking house servants who would live with their family until the child became of age. Adoption of Black orphans was a mixed blend of indentured servitude and generosity. The Biffle family, with the exception of Harriet, whose fate was unknown, were all enrolled in Pueblo schools and achieved high school diplomas. They worked before and after school and all day during the summer and holidays. They were, however, allowed to participate in school sports, something that Harold mentioned. After high school, Richard and Nathan eventually migrated to Denver for better jobs and to escape work in the Pueblo steel mill. Jenny remained in Pueblo, eventually working for the same orphanage that sheltered her family, the Pueblo Colored Orphanage and Old Folks Home. Henry also eventually moved to Denver. The Biffle family is a familiar story to me because my grandfather was Richard Biffle Sr., the oldest Biffle child. The circumstance of their journey to Colorado, as well as their fate as young people living in post-Civil War adoption arrangements, is a story that has occurred to hundreds of other African American families. In 1895, Colorado state laws specifically guaranteed all Coloradans access to the state's public places, regardless of race or color, preempting many states in the nation. Denver, the largest city in Colorado, however, was a city in which racial segregation and discrimination was more frequently the rule rather than the exception. The Klan in Colorado peaked in 1925. By this time, it had infiltrated all levels of the state government. The Klan controlled many members of the legislature, held the state Supreme Court judgeships, and 7 benches on the Denver district courts. They had controlling majorities in some town councils. Some of the most notable Klansmen at the time included Denver Mayor Ben Stapleton, Denver Police Chief William Candish, and Colorado Governor Clarence Morley. The KKK in Colorado was popular not only for its racist ideologies, but for the community events. Evangelical Protestants saw the KKK as similar to other social organizations like the Elk Lodge. A variety of local Klan members, included auto races and picnics, which drew up to 10,000 people. KKK membership was often seen as mandatory for white social and professional mobility. During its peak in Colorado, the KKK had both male and female chapters and led boycotts of many local professional businesses run by Jews, Blacks, and other minorities. In some cases, boycotts escalated to physical violence and other acts of aggression against minorities. The majority of Black people in Denver were employed as domestic servants, physical laborers, and government workers during this time. In 1890, the Denver Republican News announced that there were more colored homeowners in Denver than in any other northern city. However, the city's Black ownership were not free to buy and live wherever they chose. Denver was already a segregated city. Blacks who attempted to buy homes outside of the prescribed Negro district were often threatened with or experienced actual violence. During the 1920s and 1930s, the so-called Negro District in Denver extended east of the 5 Points to High Street. The Platte River marked the western border, and east of 21st and 32nd Street marked the districts of the southern border. Although Colorado had no law that required racial segregation in housing, hostile white owners and complicit realtors continually imposed redlining policies and practices, including restrictive covenants, mortgage lending policies, and threats of violence by white home owners. This map documents redlining policies imposed on African American residents in 1938. 5 Points was the heart of the Negro District, a neighborhood that was home to an estimated 80% of Denver's Black population. In the 3 decades of the 1920s through the 1950s, 5 Points was a thriving residential commercial hub of immense diversity, home to wealthy middle class and working class African Americans. The 5 Points neighborhood was nearly self-sustaining. 5 Point residents established and supported African American churches, stores, funeral homes, newspapers, restaurants, and extensive entertainment venues. Known nationally as the Harlem of the West, 5 Points was a jazz mecca, hosting top jazz acts during the time, including Duke Ellington, Sarah Vaughan, Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker, and more. This photo, taken in the late 1920s at Firehouse 3, was a segregated Denver station, whose captain was someone you met earlier, Nathan Biffle, one of those Biffle children. Biffle migrated, as I said, from Denver from Pueblo to Denver after graduating from high school. Once joining the fire department, he was promoted several times, however, denied the title of captain for many years. This was a common occurrence in the African American community, serving in a capacity that paid lower than white contemporaries, promoted yet losing years of seniority, income, and wealth acquisition. Racial disparities in income and net worth is a key factor in the wealth gap of African Americans, an important aspect of the reparations argument. We were always present. The presence of African Americans in Denver's religious community is another invisible factor that is unknown to non-Black residents. Two churches, Zion Baptist Church, which by the way, was actually formed 20 years after Denver was formed, and the Church of the Holy Redeemer, were located in the Whittier neighborhoods. The Black church buffered the sting of racism by providing safe spaces for African American individuals and families. With little over a century of being a vibrant hub of African American community, events, 5 Points is still capable of inspiring and incubating new entrepreneurs in the spirit of two legends. Leroy Smith, who's at your left, was the owner of the Rhythm Records and Sporting Goods shop, which featured a combination that my family always thought was fun and kind of peculiar. Top 40 hits and fishing bait, all in one location. And Charles Cousins, who began his business career while still a student attending Manual High School in the 1936 era. He provided music for the school dances of African American students who were segregated from those of white students. Both Smith and Cousins might find locating in 5 Points today financially impossible. A rule of gentrification is the displacement of residents from a neighborhood experiencing redevelopment is more often than not permanent. Lately, gentrification is looked at as being a mix of unintended consequences that most negatively impact lower income minority residents. An important part of reparations is its disheartening absence of African Americans in local history, or being invisible to other city residents. In Denver, the Black American Western Museum, the Blair Caldwell African American Research Library, collect and preserve the history and culture of African Americans in Colorado and the Rocky Mountain West. We are fortunate for their presence and contribution. However, the recent COVID-19 pandemic has impacted both institutions in different ways. One needing funding to continue on a shoestring budget, and the other needing funding to expand its research agenda to include interns and scholars that can continue to publish and obtain research on African American history in the Rocky Mountain West. As previously stated, the 5 Points Whittier neighborhoods continue to provide African American residents a community in which to experience Black respectability. Activities such as this debutante ball encouraged African American dignity, hope, and achievement. In 1948, just about the time of this photo in this slide, there was a local news article advertising a shocking report that was issued by then Mayor Quig Newton. The report, entitled Mayor Quig Newton's Survey Committee on Human Relations, analyzed the extent of prejudice and discrimination against some 65,000 Negroes, Spanish Americans, Jewish, and Japanese citizens in Denver. Some of its findings may seem contemporary. Progress is impeded when talent, energy, and the will to succeed are destroyed. Restricted covenants and housing deeds, along with gentlemen's agreements, shape geographic ghettos which breed frustration and hatred. Economic sanctions deprive thousands of a right to earn decent salaries with an inevitable result of a declining standard of living. The history of police brutality has developed a fear and a lack of respect for law enforcement to the point of becoming a serious factor in the increase of crime and juvenile delinquency. Discrimination at hotels, resorts, restaurants, and recreational facilities have shaped social patterns contrary to the American way of life. Again, these are findings that were published in 1948. Oops. Did it again. Excuse me for my mouse problems. Okay, I'm going to jump to this slide anyway. This is recognition that those findings from Quig Newton were actually some of the same things that have motivated new movements with same challenges and new solutions. In 2015, the Black Lives Matters 5280 sought to inform its neighbors not only about the Ku Klux Klan history of Ben Stapleton, but also about the failure of Forest City, the corporate Stapleton developer, to live up to its own initial goals, to reflect the diversity of the neighborhoods surrounding Stapleton, including Park Hill, Aurora, Commerce City, and East Colfax, and to provide housing inventory that would be 10% affordable and 30% rental housing. So these are efforts that are part of the protests of 2020. In Colorado, the Black infant mortality rate is nearly 3 times higher than that of whites. And the rate of diabetic in children and asthma and the level of food insecurity are higher and the lifespans lower for Black residents. Again, I'm not going to read all the slide, but these are issues that were part of the Black Lives Matter effort. So I'm leaving with this last slide. In 1951, George Brown, then a reporter for the Denver Post, wrote an article entitled, "It Happens in Denver, Jim Crow, Strong Ally of Communists in Appeal to Minorities." The impetus of the article was the frustrations African Americans were experiencing regarding piecemeal adjustments and tardy appeasement related to the shooting of a 15-year-old Negro boy by a Denver patrolman. Again, this is in 1951. One of the most prophetic remarks, among many more, was that the fact that Denver is better than most places shows that a constructive and democratic start for better human relations has been made here. But a good start is not enough. Of course, these words continue to ring true, even the circumstance in which the remarks were made. Again, the 15-year-old who was killed by a patrolman. 70 years later, we understand that there is no such thing as subtle or soft racism. Racism is racism.
Tulsa is an example
Oh, yeah.
of reparations denied. If I can get.
Yeah, stand by, Harold. I'm trying to transfer that to you. It'll take me a minute. Try now.
Thank you. In 1921, it was the worst incident of racial violence in America. Tulsa was known as the oil capital of the world by the time I grew up there, when over 700 oil companies were located in the city. In the early 1900s, Oklahoma was considered to be the promised land for many Blacks from the South. About 50 all-Black towns existed in Oklahoma at that time. My parents came from two of them, Rennesville and Vernon. Tulsa was the economic hub for most of these Black towns. A set of train tracks ran right through the middle of the city. On the south side were the gleaming white businesses. This picture was taken from those tracks looking north, where 11,000 Black citizens lived who were extremely entrepreneurial. A Black man named O.W. Gurley made his way from Huntsville, Alabama to Indian Territory and eventually bought a large tract of land on the north side of the Frisco train tracks. He mapped out a district for upwardly mobile Black city called Greenwood. The name Black Wall Street refers to the Tulsa neighborhood of Greenwood. It was given to us by Booker T. Washington. It housed one of the most successful Black economies in US history. In 1910, the average income was around $500 daily. That money stayed in the Black community. It lasted almost a year before leaving, circulating anywhere from 36 to 100 times. And in a time when the whole state had only 2 airports, 6 Black families owned their own airplanes. Some chartered their planes for Tulsa's wealthy oilmen. John B. Stratford built the luxurious 54-room Stratford Hotel on Greenwood Avenue. It was considered the finest Black-owned hotel in America at the time, with gorgeous chandeliers hanging from the ceiling of the lobby. And in the banquet room, chandeliers there, it had a dining room, a pool room, and a salon for the residence of its guests, for the relaxation of its guests. A block away, Lulu Williams built the Dreamland Theater, which had 750 seats. And get this, it was the first air-conditioned movie theater in the whole country. When I grew up in the 50s and 60s in Tulsa, we still had 2 movie theaters in the neighborhood. It is fair to say that Black Wall Street was a good example of economic envy. These freed people with the D dangling did not deserve to have the nice things or this much by the white residents of Tulsa. On May 30th, 1921, a Black teenage shoe shiner, Dick Rowland, got on an elevator in the only building that allowed colored people to use the restrooms. He got on the 3rd floor, from the 3rd floor to leave the building, and stumbled into the teenage operator, Sarah Page, and she screamed, and Rowland ran away. Without seeing anything, a clerk called the local newspaper to say that Sarah Page had been assaulted. So in 1921, you know that assaulted meant rape. Dick Rowland was captured and taken to the courthouse jail. That evening, 500 whites with weapons and alcohol stood outside the jail, demanded that Rowland be released to them. Initially, 30 Black vets of World War I came to the courthouse to offer their assistance to protect Rowland, because a year before, 2 people had been taken from the jail and lynched, so they knew the risk there. So not only were these Black soldiers turned away, but the sheriff deputized the white mob, which grew to thousands. When a scuffle between Blacks and whites resulted in a shot being fired, these white Tulsans went through the Greenwood district shooting anyone they saw, men, women, and children. And sadly, some of the shooters were children themselves. Airplanes dropped flaming kerosene bombs on the Greenwood neighborhood. Whites then positioned themselves outside of these buildings and shot the people who ran out of these burning homes. This was the first time that American citizens were bombed, 20 years before World War II. 1,200 structures were burned. Homes were looted with fires before fires were set to them. And the crowd angry that blacks had nice homes and furnishing. We had a doctor, A.C. Jackson, in the neighborhood, a black doctor, who was identified by the Mayo brothers as one of the finest surgeons in America. He was shot in front of his house as he attempted to peacefully surrender. Machine guns were reported to be used. Over 300 blacks were killed. 800 were admitted to hospitals. Many bodies were dumped in the Arkansas River. Many more were buried in mass graves. And just this week, you may have seen reports in the paper that 11 coffins were located in one of those mass graves, stacked some on top of others. The forensic identification and more sites will be investigated in the spring, but finally the city is looking to try to correct this wrong. It was a year ago that I visited the National Museum for Peace and Justice in Montgomery and looked for the lynchings that had happened in Oklahoma. Of all the 66 counties in the state, Tulsa had the most names, and many of them had the same date, May 31st, 1921. That's when I realized that many of these dead from the massacre were actually lynched. After 16 hours, the Oklahoma National Guard arrived to stop the madness. They rounded up every surviving person who had not escaped and marched them to an internment camp in the fairgrounds, some 6,000 people. The only way out was for a white employee to come and get you. Then you were forced to wear a green tag that identified you and where you worked. This lasted for many months. No one was ever prosecuted for this crime, and not a single person received a dime of insurance money or compensation for the total destruction of 40 square blocks. This is the excuse that was used to deny the insurance policies was that the massacre was defined as a riot. And so insurance policies had riot clauses in them. White Tulsans tried to hide and ignore this history. So now we're finally being heard. The current Tulsa mayor, G.T. Bynum, thanked the citizens of Tulsa for funding the work of doing something previous generations wouldn't do, find these mass graves. There were 125 living survivors in 2003. They're all now dead. Time-limited barriers must be removed. Tulsa ran to a 2-year statute of limitations in Alexander v. Oklahoma. The named plaintiff, John Alexander, was the father of my best friend, Paul Alexander. But residents rebuilt Greenwood without government assistance. It was thriving again when I grew up in the 50s and 60s. My family was part of this. My dad, Abraham Fields, is on the last row on the left. He's the person on the left there. He started a plumbing company with 12 men working for him. He trained brothers, nephews, and cousins to be plumbers. We had customers not only in the African-American community, but all of Tulsa. You know, in an interesting historical twist, the Tulsa Tribune was a paper that made the front page false story that I showed you before, Mad Negro for attacking girl in elevator. In the same issue of the Tribune was an editorial reporting on plans of white residents to lynch Dick Rowland. That led to the fever that started the riot. Decades later, I had a Tulsa Tribune route. The editor in 1921 was Richard Lloyd Jones. The editor of the paper in the 60s was Richard's son, Jenkins Lloyd Jones. He was a customer of my dad's plumbing company, and I'd been in his house numerous times. That house, by the way, was designed by their famous cousin architect, Frank Lloyd Wright. Lloyd was a thing with them. But then Greenwood was decimated again in the 70s and 80s, this time by urban renewal. Urban renewal undid what was rebuilt by so many people who created a loving environment for us. John W. Rogers, the great grandson of J.B. Stratford, the hotel owner, years ago said, Greenwood shows what, when we are left to our own devices and don't have a knee to our neck, we can achieve ordinary things, extraordinary things. Now, how interesting is the parallel of Ruth Bader Ginsburg asking that men remove their feet from the neck of women and the sight of a policeman's knee on the neck of George Floyd for 9 minutes. So remember, the three things to ask about history: who's telling it, who benefits, and who is missing. Now, Marilyn's time.
Thank you, Harold. And so now the time is to talk about, what does reparation look like? Oops, went the wrong way. Reparations is a system of redress, meaning that there's several parts that are interdependent, dealing with the injustices that Blacks have endured. The definition, however, is quite clear, that the first issue is making amends for a wrong one has done. And this amends can be by payment of money or otherwise helping those who have been wrong. The second definition, and again, this is from the Oxford Dictionary, is the actual compensation for damage. And in this particular instance, the statements for war damage paid by a defeated state. The third definition is a process and the result of remedy the damage or harm has caused by an unlawful act. And so we'll be getting into that shortly. So when we talk about the why, there are several models that are currently in place in different states about reparations. And they all kind of collapse themselves into some of the injustices that have happened to Black people, including enslavement, segregation, denied housing, segregation from mainstream education, loaning practices, disproportionate unemployment rates and reduced opportunities, inadequate if not detrimental health care, and unjustly targeting by law enforcement. In addition, Black people have been incarcerated at disproportionate rates and are living in environmentally toxic sites that negatively impact their health and property. And lastly, Black people are disproportionately suffered from isolation of food deserts and child care deserts. The House resolution, and it's called HR 40, that was originally designed by John Conyers of Michigan, initially started with a national apology for the legacy of enslavement. I think that most people do not know that the number 40 goes back to that original issue that Harold brought up about 40 acres and a mule. John Conyers wanted to have the nation remember that that number 40 is part of the reparations dialogue. Harold?
Yes.
I'll get you there. There you go.
My grandfather had a farm in Oklahoma. He had 80 acres and 2 mules. And one of those mules was very mean and broke his ribs. He wanted to kill that mule, but he needed that mule to plow the fields. There's a litigation approach to reparations, which involves defendants. And those defendants could be federal, state, and city governments, corporations, universities, and even religious bodies. When it comes to plaintiffs, William Darity Jr., an economist at Duke University, and a leading scholar on reparations, suggests there are two qualifying conditions for being a plaintiff. One, having at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States, and this is intended to address the question of forced migration. And two, having identified oneself as Black, colored, African-American, or Negro in a legal document for at least a decade before the approval of any reparations. That 10-year rule would help screen out anyone who was trying to cash in on a windfall. Then, of course, there are damages. That's the third component of a tort model. Some economists evaluate the labor share of the slave system's profits in cotton and tobacco. Others have looked at what slaves would have earned if they had been paid just wages. William Darity looked at 40 acres of mule, taking into account compounding interest and inflation, and he puts the present value at $2.6 trillion. He also says that for reparations to be effective, we would have to close the pre-tax racial wealth disparity in the United States, and that would cost from 10 to $12 trillion. That's enough to make anybody's eyes glaze over. But there are some problems with the tort method alone. First of all, lawyers. Now, no offense to any lawyers in the group, but we can obfuscate the truth, we can exaggerate, and we can not get to the heart of what the issues are in trying to win a case. Litigation can't bring forth a genuine apology from the main perpetrator, the federal government. The chief characteristic of the tort model is incompatible to racial harmony and reconciliation. It can only result in an insufficient development of the historical record, which we believe needs to be accurately told. So when you think about Brown v. Board, that's a good example of massive resistance to desegregation as a result of a court decision. And I would expect the same kind of blowback from a court decision on reparation. A legislative approach would engage the population in the debate and decision to move forward. Legislation is needed at the federal level because all of the policies were instituted by Uncle Sam. But cities are starting to look at that legislation as well, such as Evanston, Illinois, and Asheville, North Carolina. In some cases, they're being creative about taking marijuana profits and going to increasing home ownership or intergenerational wealth. Now, remember that card trick we started with at the beginning? The trick of those in power is to get us to focus on writing a check and not seeing the kind of things necessary to make the medicine of money effective. The concept of rehabilitative reparations must contain the element of atonement. It must be accomplished by a change of heart. Rehabilitative reparations are directed toward the victim's group or community. They're designed to benefit the group, to nurture the group's self-empowerment, and thus aid the whole nation's social and cultural transformation. Professor Eric Miller says that reparations must also include rebuilding the social, political, economic, and cultural institutions that were destroyed by the state. Without this, what we have is race-neutral policies now will maintain the imbalance across the nation. We need to create some sort of mechanism for asset building in the Black community. I have long felt that reparations is a process, not an event, something that is to be participated in by everybody. The baby bonds proposal is an example. If that were created, a child born into a family at the lowest end of the wealth distribution could be given $50 a trust fund that could grow to $50,000 or $60,000 when it matured. So we have to think creatively. But also remember that in 2012, the majority of births in this country were children of color. So the fate of the nation and the future is in the hands of those who have been left behind. Where is the resistance today? In the early 1990s, a study of American attitudes towards reparations showed that only 4% of whites were in favor. That means 96% were against it. Today, it's closer to 20% in favor. Can we move that needle to 40, 45% or higher despite the Trump presidency? That seems possible in the time of George Floyd protests and the awareness coming from the Black Lives Matter movement. We believe that local people can lead by exploring a new set of healing actions. The truth is, the white indifference about slavery reflects the fact that the South actually won the ideological victory in the Civil War. The South convinced the rest of the nation that the role of slavery in American history should be thoroughly diminished, even somehow as a cause for the war, Civil War. The terrible price of reconciliation and reunion in the North and the South was marginalizing slavery and race. There was some sense that Black Americans were not deserving of reparations because they bear the responsibility for their own conditions. We know that not to be the case. That plays a deep role in the resistance to all Black progress. So you see here some of the examples of things people say to prevent this discussion about repair. You've heard them. Some may ring true to you. I keep thinking it goes back to the 1857 Dred Scott case, where Chief Justice Roger Taney issued the opinion that the Negro had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. And that has been a cultural meme in the United States for a long time. The new roadblock could be the changing nature of the Supreme Court. It can be a real present danger to the possibilities of healing the legacy of slavery. But I think as I've wrapped this up, the important thing to think about is closure. Closure is the acknowledgement on the part of the victimized community that they have received a satisfactory set of compensations from the victimizers, and that they have no reason to request anything that's specifically for their group in the future unless there's a new wave of injustice. Closure means healing, but not forgetting. So with that, I'd like to bring this to a close and get us positioned for Q&A. And Patricia, it's your call as to whether we should take a break or we should keep rolling.